Well, I didn't like the result of that last recorded session because of the music. It was overbearing. So there is no music this time. I was looking at the statistics on my YouTube account. Yesterday I had 8 subscribers. Today I have 10. So again, I welcome 2 new subscribers. I might mention influences. Now, they're the very old influences. When I was a boy, I read Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. And then when I was in junior high and early high school, I read Ray Bradbury, some. And much later on, I came across J.G. Ballard, an English science fiction writer, who became quite famous. So, those are my influences. Well, others, Arthur C. Clarke, of course. What was that? Roger Zelazny, I think his name was. He's a black fellow. Full beard. He wrote Dahlgren. That book was of some influence. And there are many others, I suppose, but those are the main ones. Anyway, I have many, many other influences from, you know, literary fiction, but these stories are not literary fiction. All right, the next story are from Tales of the Bizzare and Unnatural is titled The Sports Facility. Sports Facility. Before I took over the duties as manager of the sports facility aboard the Trans-Martian Delta liner, the man who would soon be my immediate predecessor invited me to his office, now my office, to have a few drinks and a long chat. His name was Klaus von Clapper, although he told me that he preferred to be called Jing. He bore a bald scalp and a clipped mustache and walked with the assistance of a cane because, he told me, a woman had once plummeted onto his leg while he was sunbathing in the solar room. She had fallen from a second-floor balcony. They had been having problems with the simulated gravity generators that day, he tried to explain. I can only surmise that she had been under the impression that she still remained in a state of relative weightlessness while practicing a gymnastics routine beyond the balcony railing. The facilities was very crowded, as I recall, and she'd taken advantage of what was normally unusable space. I told him my name, Nick Evans. You should adopt a single name, he said. It's the fashionable thing to do nowadays. So what would you like to drink? I have gin, whiskey, vodka, you name it. Whiskey with a squirt of seltzer and a twist of lemon, I said. Precise instructions, but I think I can manage. Yes, Mr. Evans, after my accident, or should I say, the unfortunate woman's accident, poor thing, still in a coma, or so I've heard. My job suddenly became far too demanding for me, and I've been forced into retirement. I thought it only wise to give you some details about the job, he went on, which the hiring committee doubtlessly overlooked. Forewarned is forearmed, don't you know? To start with, you need to bear in mind that the simulators are one of the most popular features that we have to offer. If someone wants to experience pole vaulting 18 feet, we can provide that experience, and it will affect the participant's mind and body precisely as if he or she had actually executed such a demanding and complex maneuver. But they will then have to go through a recovery period, so you must make it perfectly clear to all our clients who want to run either a competitive mile or a marathon, they must first be in what we consider minimal condition. No one is permitted to use the simulators without first being in minimal condition. You must remember that, otherwise the Trans-Martian Delta liner could be sued. Fancy equipment in the future, wouldn't you say? Anti-gravitation devices. All sorts of interesting new developments in the future. Awaits us, no doubt. Well, let's see. We also provide the simulated experiences of the more combative sports, such as wrestling or judo. I found that I had to eliminate boxing and karate, however, because, well, because of a series of unfortunate incidents which proved conclusively that our minimal condition requirements fell far short of the mark. Even with our accelerated recovery sessions, those poor souls who'd undergone the simulated kicks and punches were simply unable to, well, to return to their former healthy states when they expired. Autopsies were performed, of course, and the findings were oddly, though perhaps not surprisingly, uniform. Each of the individuals who'd been allowed to make use of the boxing or karate simulators had soon died from heart attacks. Jing shook his head and took a long sip from his glass of vodka. You would think that in our collective confinement aboard this liner, most of our clients would want to experience the simulations of climbing a mountain or hiking through deserted countryside. But no, no, that is simply not the case. And I must confess, Mr. Evans, that I've always been puzzled by this. I have no explanation for it. Football and soccer are extremely popular. If only we had 50 more simulation pods just for those two sports. All right, that was relatively short. I'll do one more. This next story follows a very, very old form of long tradition. The Three Wishes of Ernst Pavlo. Having arisen from bed at his usual early hour, a slightly variable event which never failed to occur between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, Ernst Pavlo began his day in solitary, quiet comfort. The windows of the neighboring homes would remain darkened until much later, when radio alarm clocks aroused people into another day of work at their respective jobs. Recently retired, Ernst required no such device. He awoke without such an assist, an old habit from his former career as a journalist. But as with most people, he could never dispense with the ritual he performed each still blackened morning, brewing coffee. His was a bargain basement coffee maker, which, after much use, now issued a good deal of steam and a rapid stream of loud popping and gurgling noises when the pot was nearly full. Thus he wished absently that he had a fancy stainless steel machine, the sort you would see in an espresso bar. Not even a minute after this vague wish passed through his mind, while he was now recalling his dear father, a physics professor who had managed to spirit his family out of Budapest, Hungary, just prior to the Russian-Soviet invasion in 1956, Ernst heard the unmistakable lumbering of a delivery truck as it pulled up in front of his house. "What the hell?" he muttered aloud. "What could that be?" He then heard a door roll open, this followed by a series of rapid steps growing progressively louder, until a brief pause on the porch and an immediate and unceremonious thud. The steps then retreated in the opposite direction, and a moment later the truck rumbled off. How weird, he thought, as he went to the front door in his pajamas, bathrobe, and slippers. He flipped on the porch light switch and opened the door to an inrush of cold fog swirling air, and looked down just in front of his feet at a nondescript cardboard box. Now utterly mystified and not a little apprehensive, he stooped down to collect the box and took it into the house, closing the door with a deft nudge from his foot. Just then his wife appeared in the entrance to the living room. She wore a light purple bathrobe, and her long black hair was in disarray about her face. She brushed some of this aside and asked in an irritated voice, petulant with her unexpected arousal from bed, "Ernst, just what is going on? I heard a delivery truck pull away a moment ago. A delivery truck at this ungodly hour?" "Believe me, Olivia, I haven't the faintest idea." "Just try to be quiet, dear. Unlike you, I still have to go to work in the morning." Without another word, she returned to the bedroom. As much as he loved his wife, Ernst admitted to himself that she still had the easy power to exasperate him at times. He was certainly not the one who had dispatched the delivery truck. When he opened the box, now atop the kitchen table, Ernst dropped onto a chair, all but astonished. He could hardly believe what his eyes beheld, a rather expensive-looking Braun coffee maker. Stupefied is the only word that could now describe his state of mind. The next night, again up at his usual early hour, Ernst Pavlo was a different man. He did not sit at his desk to pen the next few pages to a film script, a romantic comedy upon which he had been working steadily for the last several weeks. His literary agent had only just phoned him the other day from Los Angeles and quizzed him as to his progress. "Ernst, when do you think you'll finish, old buddy? I swear, there are clamoring for it. These film people are always in a hurry." Matthew Pearson knew the territory well and had sold Pavlo's first script just 6 months ago. A dark horror tale with plenty of exploitive and visually stunning gore. Soon, Pierce, soon. Another 2 weeks tops. I'll email you the full draft in 2 weeks. No problem, Ernst assured him. No, Ernst Pavlo was not in the proper frame of mind to work any further on his film script. The inexplicable delivery of the gourmet coffee maker had left him profoundly troubled. Had the date been just a few days before Christmas Eve, he could have convinced himself that some anonymous benefactor from Hollywood had sent it to him in the seasonal spirit of gift-giving. Olivia, obviously having had no part in this strange occurrence, belabored him late that afternoon when she returned home from work in a rather foul mood. "I couldn't get back to sleep last night because of that freakish delivery, Ernst. And all day long I was hardly better than a zombie. I don't understand why you can't do your damned writing during the day," she told him, her voice growing more shrill by the moment. Ernst paced through the house, distracted, preoccupied, alert to the slightest odd noise, such as the faint, distant wail of a siren a moment ago. He just could not bring himself to sit at his desk and work on his romantic comedy. He was too anxious, still far too puzzled to jot down a single word. He recalled how Olivia spoke to him earlier that evening, upbraiding him for his extravagance, since she was convinced that he had placed an online order for the coffee maker without consulting her. "How do you think we can have a proper marriage if you conceal things from me, Ernst? Will you tell me that? I don't appreciate being kept in the dark." Well, he thought, maybe he had gone overboard when he bought the new Lexus and that hand-tailored suit with the money he received from his horror film script. Not that Olivia should complain, since she drove the new car every day, leaving a 2001 Honda Civic for him. She's so bloody aggressive sometimes, he thought. Throws her emotional weight around, takes him to task for the smallest infractions, just like a mother scolding a child, and he resented it. By God, sometimes when Olivia worked herself up into one of her fits of moral indignation, he wished that she would simply drop dead. At that moment, Ernst heard a muffled moan from the upstairs bedroom. Something's the matter with Olivia, he realized, and he pounded up the stairway as her moans grew louder. He burst through the door to see her sprawled diagonally on the bed, the covers thrown back, her hair had tumbled over her face, which bore an alarming blue tint. Ernst rushed up to her. "Olivia, Olivia!" he shouted, but her face was devoid of any trace of life. He threw himself down on her and tried to resuscitate her with CPR, prying open her mouth and sealing his own mouth upon her clammy lips and forcing rhythmic surges of air into her lungs. Later, the paramedics arrived. They examined her and pronounced her dead, heart failure. As the two paramedics rolled Olivia's inert body out of the house upon a gurney, Ernst looked on in a kind of numb dismay. Oh, Christ, he kept thinking. He had killed her with a mere importunate wish. He could hardly even reason any longer. Nothing from the last 2 terrifying days made any sense. He glanced out through the garage door just off the kitchen and looked at the gray-silver Lexus alongside the box-shaped Civic. What would he do now without his wife, without dear Olivia? Unable to work, unable to sleep, unable to hardly even think, Ernst got into the Lexus and started the engine. It occurred to him that he could sit there as the engine idled in the garage, gradually filled with carbon monoxide from the car's exhaust. But the thought of his own death appalled him even more than he was already appalled and frightened. What was he going to do? With the radio tuned to an all-night news station affiliated with NPR, Ernst drove out of the garage and into the unforgiving night. The door to the garage slowly descended as he pulled carefully out of the driveway and drove down the darkened street. From his days of investigative reporting, Ernst knew of a few residences on the other side of town where a fellow could get an after-hours drink. You could sit in the living room with Mr. and Mrs. Jones, pay for an expensive glass of whiskey with ice, and have a brief chat. Mr. Jones was a lean, retired postal carrier, and Mrs. Jones helped run a soup kitchen from the basement of a Baptist church on Fremont. The news was the usual plethora of calamities. Greece continued to teeter on the edge of bankruptcy, poised to pull down the entire economy of the European Union. The largest economy in the world. More starvation in the Sudan, thanks to warlords and their ragtag armies who intercepted shipments of food from the Red Cross and UNESCO. An accelerated depletion of ice in the Arctic and Antarctica. The further slaughter of civilians in Syria. Only a half of a mile from the apartment building where Mr. and Mrs. Jones lived, Ernst pulled off to the side of the empty street and wept. During a series of convulsive sobs, tears streamed down his face and snot dripped from his nose. When this attack of sorrow lifted, he removed a handkerchief from his trouser pocket and first dabbed his eyes and then blew his nose. In some fashion, he then felt purged, cleansed. If only the world were at peace, he thought, his most fervent wish yet. If only the world were at peace. A few moments later, the radio in his Lexus fell silent. Some studio engineer asleep at the switch, he thought. A couple of blocks further, and Ernst saw a police car mangled at a diagonal into the side of a brick building, steam rising up from beneath its contorted hood. A rippling chill dove into his bowels. Now he needed that drink more than ever. At last, having climbed 3 flights of stairs, now standing in front of the door to the Jones apartment, Ernst felt shaken and close to a kind of mute hysteria, and he pressed the doorbell and unleashed a swift series of chimes. He waited, hearing none of the comforting footsteps he had always anticipated in the past. This immediately followed by the smiling, jovial greeting of Mr. Jones once the door had swung open. But tonight, there was no one to let him in. He tried the doorknob, but of course it did not yield. Exhausted from his own apprehension, Ernst suddenly recalled that the old fellow had once mentioned that he kept a key hidden beneath the doormat, and joked that if Ernst came at a truly late hour, after he and Mrs. Jones had gone to bed, why, just use the key, let your own self in, pour a drink, and don't forget to leave a $10 bill on the coffee table. Ernst snatched the rubber mat away, nearly having flung it aside, and saw the single key lying like a priceless relic on the floor. He unlocked the door and stole soundlessly into the apartment, only to find Mr. Jones apparently transfixed in front of the television. Ernst, with his practiced journalist's eye for detail, soon noticed that the poor old fellow was quite dead. And Mrs. Jones, having gone to bed earlier that night, not wanting to watch the antics of Conan O'Brien, now lay completely unalterably still, her eyes permanently closed to the world. Ernst gently shut the bedroom door, and returned to the living room and poured himself a stiff drink, a good 4 ounces of bourbon. At first light, Ernst emerged from the apartment building and walked with an unconquerable dejection and anxiety to his car. The radio proved to be silent on each of its pre-selected channels. After driving aimlessly through the deserted streets, Ernst finally came to the building, a newspaper building where he'd spent the last 8 years of his career as the night editor. He pulled into the nearly empty basement parking lot and shut off the car's engine. A deafening, high-pitched roar rang through his ears from the bourbon. Once in front of the elevator, he removed his employee's security card, which he never relinquished, from his wallet, and swiped it through the vertical track, and the door slid open obediently. The elevator carried Ernst to the 5th floor, the door slid open, and he entered the newsroom, now strangely silent as a sepulchre. Ernst sat at the first desk he came to and picked up the phone and dialed 911. He let the number ring a dozen times before he hung up. Then he noticed a faint, low hissing sound and saw that the huge flat-screen monitor, perpetually tuned to CNN, featured nothing but a buzzing froth of snow. Ernst swung his arm across the desk in a fit of impotent rage, sending the phone flying to the floor with a clanging clatter. 7 billion people, he thought, all dead because he had wished for peace. It wasn't possible. Couldn't he? He just couldn't.